how do you explain all these archaeological anomalies or things like that, or alleged anomalies, I have to say, because archaeologists aren't nearly as confused as people on the show Ancient Aliens. And there are many different examples we can go through, and the one we focus on was the pyramids because, one, it's like the most iconic symbol of what looks like some amazing great thing done by people in great antiquity, and it seems like that couldn't possibly be done by those primitive people back then. Now, of course, you look at the Egyptians and you're calling them primitive. Okay, I smell some racism, and if I keep smelling, I actually look and see, oh, there's this entire Victorian book of, the big book of Victorian racism, which is really where so much of this stuff comes from. These ideas that there's no way these primitive peoples could have done these things, even though the people literally living around those monuments can talk about how their ancestors did it. In the case of the pyramids, there are, some legitimate mysteries of its ultimate construction, but the thing is, it was not that like one day, all of a sudden they were building these giant monuments. We can actually see over centuries an evolution of indigenous Egyptian burial practices, and literally going from burying to the ground to burying the ground but with a special mound over it called a mastaba, to stacking these mastabas on top of each other into a step pyramid shape, until somebody saying, hey, let's make that look more like a pretty mountain. And the attempts to do that, and the failed attempts to do that, because we also see the Egyptians not always getting it right the first time. Some of the pharaohs basically had to have like 2 or 3 attempts to finally build the pyramid that they were buried in. So if the aliens were helping, the aliens were on the job learning it too, and somehow the aliens were also using copper chisels in the construction of this sloping pile of rocks, which, by the way, is the only construction you can build of that size if you don't have reinforcing materials. If you had reinforcing iron, you can build things straight up. So the fact that they're building sloping piles of rocks instead of skyscrapers kind of indicates it's almost like they don't even have Iron Age technology.
And isn't there a pyramid called the slanting pyramid, where they started building, realized they got it wrong, and they had to change the angle to the sides?
Yeah, that it's called the bent pyramid, because you can literally see the angle change halfway up, because they realize, hey, this angle we're going at is too steep and this is going to collapse on us, so they change the angle to a shallower one towards the other end. I believe this was one of the pyramids built for the pharaoh Djoser, and Djoser was like, I'm not putting my body in that. No, go and try again. And so the next pyramid, called the red pyramid because of its red clay coloring, that one came out okay, and that's the one that Djoser was then buried in. And after Djoser, his son Khufu wanted to outdo his daddy, and that's the Great Pyramid of Giza. The largest of the pyramids at Giza would start with the pharaoh Khufu, and then later his sons Khafre and Menkaure had their pyramids built, not quite as big as daddy's, or granddaddy's in that case, but still the 3 most prominent pyramids in the Giza plateau were developed after the successes and failures of the previous pharaoh, who himself was advancing previous simpler pyramid design.